In the previous module, you were already introduced to the UV editor, but I want to bring it up again because this is what we're going to be using to be able to adjust the UVs for the model. So if you go under Window, Modeling Editors, UV Editor, it will open it up. Now, by default, sometimes it'll come in two separate pieces with the UV editor and the UV Toolkit. Sometimes it's together. For ease of use, I like to drag the UV Toolkit into the UV editor so that I have access to everything I need while I'm working on the UVs. As you can see, this crate, through its modeling process, has already got the default cube UV maps laid out. So if I grab a portion, for example, these faces, you see that's how those are laid out. This is laid out here across these three sections. And so it is laid out, but it's not really working for what I would want it to do. When you're doing UV mapping, especially for objects that are going to have a custom space, and this is where I'm going to start talking about 0 to 1. Once again, the 0 to 1 area is from here, from the 0 to +1 and from 0 to +1. So in this square, if you want a unique texture, you're going to want to fit everything in that square. There are things called tileable textures where the texture will repeat itself and continue on, where the UVs would actually go out of that 0 to 1 area. But for right now, focus on doing your UV mapping in the 0 to 1 area. As part of that, you also need to make sure that there isn't any overlap. So right now where this is, it's actually overlapping those UVs. You want to make sure that all of the UVs have their own custom space. The reason for this is because as we go through the modeling, UV map, and texturing process, especially as you start working on things that have higher resolution, that are for more updated platforms, you're going to be adding in additional texture passes, things like normal mapping and specular maps. And in the case of normal maps, you need to make sure that things aren't overlapping, because where one section might push in, another one might pop out, and everything just kind of needs its own space. So for now, just focus on making sure that your UV mapping doesn't have any sections that overlap, that it's laid out in the 0 to 1 space, and that it makes sense for you. So those are kind of the ground rules for the decision-making process with UV mapping. So I want to show you a couple of the tools and some of the reasons we've been modeling and working the way we have been so far. So to begin, I will select this object. And if I come up here to the top to UV, and by the way, if you're not seeing this, make sure that you're in the modeling menu. Go UV, and there are different ways that it will do the UV mapping. I can set it for cylindrical, planar, spherical, camera base. There's a lot of different ones. But I'm going to have you start by going to Automatic. And as you can see, it has already laid everything out for me, which works really well. So it's already calculated, given everything its own space, and kind of cut up the pieces in a way that makes sense to it and laid them out. Now I want to show you what will happen if this was not built at the origin at right angles. So if I actually had changed this a little bit, rotating it, and I go Edit, Delete All by Type History, Modify, Freeze Transforms. So it's saying, hey, this is its default position. Now if I go UV Automatic, you can see that it's still calculating it based on that cube shape that's at the origin and right angles. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at the origin. I prefer working from there for a lot of different reasons. But having it at right angles where it's not twisted like this, this is one of the reasons why we avoid that. And it's because, as you can see, it's trying to calculate it, but it gets everything a little bit skewed and makes it a little more difficult to work with. So I'm going to step back. So hitting Control Z. Once again, if you're on a Mac, you can do Command Z as well. And if you need to, again, you can select your object and go UV Automatic. But this is the base layout. Now I want to guide you through a few of the tools that are here in the UV Toolkit so that you can get an understanding of how they work. When you're modeling or when you're doing UV mapping, just like with the modeling process, you can grab different components. So I can grab by face, and using the regular QWERTY keys, I can move this, I can rotate it, I can scale it. I'm going to turn on this. So this button right here turns on a grid so you can see kind of how things relate to each other, what their scale is. So for example, if I scale this one piece clear up, I'm going to focus in on it so you can see it on the side. You can see that right now these don't have an even amount of UV space. This one scaled clear up, so it's getting a lot more pixels in that space. This one is not as much, so there's less room. In general, when you're working on models, you want to make sure that the squares are all roughly the same size so that when you have textures on the object, they match up. So you don't have like one area that's very pixelated and another area that's really clean and smooth. You want it to kind of work out evenly. So let me turn this back off. So as you can see, you can use the regular movement, move, rotate, scale, to adjust things. You can also grab an edge. And if you notice, when I grab an edge, it's actually grabbing both sides of that edge. In the 3D space, it's a single edge, and it's right there. But when you're cutting things in 2D, there's actually a separation. You can actually cut out each individual face, which means that there's multiple edges. Same thing, vertex. I can grab a vertex, but as you notice, that's a lot of different points in here, and this is why we are doing UVs. UVs are the individual separated pieces of that vertice that are attached to each face. And so you're not moving vertices, you're moving UVs. So I can grab an individual UV and move it. I can shift, select multiple UVs and move, rotate, scale, and play around with all of those. I can actually Control Z to step back. I'm going to start showing you a few other tools in here. There are a lot of different tools, and I encourage you to start looking through the Maya documentation to figure out what they are, but not all of them are as big of a priority right here at the beginning. One you should be aware of again, there's also soft select. So if anybody's trying to grab something doing UV mapping and you notice that you're getting a whole lot of stuff and it's going weird, that's probably why. So make sure that soft select is turned off. Once again, it's a tool that has a time and a purpose, but for this type of a model where it's not organic, there's very hard edges, and I want to keep things very aligned, I'm not going to worry about the soft select. There are different things you can do for transforms, for adjusting pivots, for moving things. So you can see I can actually move where this is adjusting from. So I can change where it's scaling simply by changing where I'm grabbing it. There's also, retain component spacing. You can do snap step. You can do all the basic moves and adjustments that you would normally find. With that open though, I can come down to tools, and this is where I do want to start showing you some things that I would encourage you to play around with. For example, rotate. I can change how much of a rotation I want if I need to have one, so I can do it 22.5 and then tell it to rotate that far. If I want it to be 90 degrees, I can do that. And you don't notice a change here, but if I grab two of them, then you would notice the change. You can also change the scale at a snap step, and you can flip it. So let me grab something like this so it'll be a little bit more obvious. I can flip that over. This is something you want to watch out for though, because in some cases when you flip it, just like with polygons having face normals that you need to have going a specific direction, you also want your UVs to have the face normals coming towards you. If I flip this, and so it's on the other side, especially when you get into advanced textures such as normal maps, it can actually reverse things. So for example, if we're painting the texture for all of this wood and the wood grains are going in, and I have one of these that's flipped over, it'll actually cause it to come out and it will react differently than you might expect. So you want to work with everything in the direction that it's set up. Moving down, if I open up cut and sew, this is the next set of tools you should be aware of. For example, if I grab an edge, you can see that it's got these two edges together. So I'm going to grab these faces. I'm going to grab one, and then if you double click, It selects everything that's within that shell. You can also go select, and I'm not seeing it on here right now. So it looks like that changed. They used to be able to just select shell, but you can do the same thing. The shell is all the pieces that are connected together in a single unit. But if you double click, you can also do this with UV selected. Double click allows you to select everything in that shell. You can move a section at a time. And I'm going to move these next to each other so that when I grab the edge, you can see what's happening. So if I grab this edge, you can see the correlating edge. And so let's say I want to line this up so that I can sew these pieces together. Well, I can simply sew, but as you can see it becomes deformed, which can cause problems with the way I'm painting the texture. Instead, I can select Stitch Together, and that will pull those pieces together. If I come and grab the next edge and do Stitch Together, you can see it pulls it together and keeps it roughly the same size. If the edges are different sized, then it will try and compensate for it. So for example, if I have this section scaled up a little bit more and stitched together, oh, I take it back. It is now adjusting. So apparently the new one does a little bit more to adjust than the old one did. But hopefully you get the idea. That it will actually move things together, where if I just simply sew, then it will deform it and find a middle ground to connect those. The other thing I can do is if I have pieces together that I don't want together, I can grab those components, so grabbing this edge, and I can cut. Once I cut it, I can individually select this section and pull it away. I can then grab this edge and this edge and this edge and this edge, cut those. And if you'll notice, there's an actual color change. Where it's sewn together, the edges become blue. Where it's not sewn together, they are white. And so I can pull those pieces now apart and sew those in different ways, or stitch together. There are many other tools that have helped to simplify and make things a little bit better. The other ones I want to point out for right now, though, for this module, are the snap tools. So there are certain cases where things may not line up the way you want them to. For example, if I want these UVs to be lined up with this shape, I can snap. Oh, let me get this to snap correctly. Excuse me, this is where I'm messing up. I want this to align. So with a line, it will go down, and it aligns to whatever direction you want it to. So for example, with these, if I align down, which is these going down to the flat line, it goes that direction. If I Control Z and step back, if I line up, it snaps upwards. If I align to the left, you see they go over there. Align to the right. If I align in the center, it finds that middle point, align to the center. And so using align can help you get things matched up when you need to. So for example, if this wasn't resizing itself and matching up the way it is right now, I might need to align it to be able to get this to be the correct size after having accidentally scaled it up. And so now this is roughly the same size as everything else. Now when I do the stitch together, it all lines up. The other one, the snap, and that's where I was making a mistake right now, allows you to snap it within that 0 to 1 space. So I can snap that to the top left, bottom right, bottom left, top right. And so that's just another section. You can also use the snaps, like snap to point, snap to grid, in the same way you could anywhere else. So if I snap to grid, I can move that. If I snap to point, I can line it up with these points and still adjust, and that allows me to align. So for right now, take a little bit of time and start playing with some of these basic tools. So the first thing is just grabbing by component, so edges, faces, UVs, and even vertices, just see what they do. And start playing with move, rotate, scale, get used to that. And then if you need to correct things, play around down here with aligning So grabbing sections, learn to align them, try snapping them to specific areas. So grabbing this, play around with cutting and sewing. So stitching that together, stitching this on, grabbing that edge, stitching that together, selecting an edge, cutting it, grabbing that shell by double clicking on the UV, moving that around. But get used to these basic movements and play around with the tools. The more you play and the more you experiment right now, the better off you're going to be down the road. So please take some time right now and play around with the tools so that you can get used to them.